Our next topic is 2 Corinthians. Before we dive in, I have another scholarly side dish to share with you. 2 Corinthians has discontinuities from section to section. It has what you might call fault lines that run through it. And scholars suggest that what we're looking at is actually an amalgam of a number of different original letters. A passage in the middle, 6:14 to 7:1, looks like a digression, and it has a less Pauline style than the rest of the letter. It doesn't share the vocabulary or the topic of what comes right before it or right after it. You could actually remove that passage and the transitions would be much smoother. Chapters 10 through 13 have a very different attitude towards the audience, towards the Corinthians, than the chapters that come before them. And chapters 8 and 9 seem to duplicate each other. So a number of scholars have suggested that 2 Corinthians includes embedded excerpts from other letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, or even to other congregations. Your surveys treat this topic, but it's worth a quick look. 1 Corinthians 5:9 refers to an earlier letter that Paul had written before he wrote 1 Corinthians. Let's call letter A the so-called lost letter, or the letter that just isn't preserved, that comes before 1 Corinthians. Although when we go to that passage, when we go to 1 Corinthians 5:9, the topic of that passage matches this odd excerpt. He says in 1 Corinthians 5:9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. And he goes on, I'm not talking about people like that in the world. You'd have no one left to associate with. I'm talking about people within the church. So if we look at 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1, that's the topic. Don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And that unequally yoked language refers to marriage. What partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? And so on. So some people guess that that passage in 2 Corinthians 6 is really perhaps an excerpt of that so-called lost letter. It's just a guess. Next in the chain of Paul's letters to the Corinthians would be 1 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians, Paul refers to a tearful letter that followed. And that doesn't sound like 1 Corinthians. He's not talking about that letter. So there seems to be another letter in between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians that hurt the congregation and brought them to repentance and a real measure of reconciliation. He refers to it in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and chapter 7. What about the matter of chapters 10 through 13, which have such a more confrontational, hurt, desperate feel to them? Could those chapters be part of that tearful letter? Well, possibly. So if we call Paul's tearful letter letter C, then that might include and explain chapters 10 through 13. And it might explain the rough transition between reconciliation in chapter 7 and suddenly alienation and worry in chapter 10. If this is the case, then 2 Corinthians, in part or in whole, would follow that tearful letter. Chapters 1 through 9, or maybe just chapters 1 through 7, or maybe just chapters 1 through the middle of 6. Anyway, the body of 2 Corinthians would follow that tearful letter and the response that it aroused. Then some scholars speculate that chapters 10 through 13 could be a later letter that followed some later disturbance in the relationship between Paul and this church. Well, it's possible. Or like I said, it might have been part of that earlier tearful letter. Chapter 13 talks about Paul visiting a third time, and that would fit if 10 through 13 were that earlier letter rather than a further later one. Then there's the matter of the redundant messages about the collection to Jerusalem in chapter 8 and then in chapter 9. Maybe chapter 8 follows, maybe that's letter F. And letter F could have come after 2 Corinthians or it could have come before 2 Corinthians. So there's no real way to tell. And then if the duplication between chapter 8 and 9 indicates two different original letters, one of them might have been to the Corinthians and one of them might have been to Achaia, and they might have been stuck together. Now there's no independent evidence for any of these letters circulating in any other form than what we have in 2 Corinthians in the order that we have them in 2 Corinthians. So there's no independent historical or textual evidence for this kind of embedded letter within a letter. It's just scholarly speculation to try to solve the puzzle of why these fault lines are there in the text in a way that really doesn't sound like Paul anywhere else. And this is something you often see in so-called source criticism, is hypotheses to try to explain features of the text when really all they have to go on is the text itself. And that means hypotheses are all we have and really all we're going to have. And that leads to another side dish in response to this one. In response to these sort of unanswerable questions that source criticism tends to raise, so-called canonical critics want to emphasize that these texts come to us in the form they are in a New Testament and an Old Testament that we have, and we should really just pay attention to them in their current form. Biblical criticism is supposed to clarify our understanding of the texts. Well, canonical critics ask, at what point are these questions taking our focus off the texts themselves and taking us into a hypothetical world that we'll never really be able to settle on? Scholars tend to find what they expect to see. Scholars who look for disunity tend to find more disunity. Scholars who want to find unity and expect to find unity tend to find reasons to reinforce their suspicions. That's pretty much of a human trait, and more education doesn't seem to remove it from our psyches. So while I want to introduce you to these approaches, these side dishes, I also want you to bear in mind, I'm not recommending that you focus on them, especially on problems that we won't be able to solve anyway. They tend to paralyze readers of the New Testament rather than empower them. They're worth entertaining, though. How should we approach matters of probability where this is more likely than that, but where we'll never be sure? Canonical critics want to resolve this problem, really dissolve this problem, by appealing to the final form of the text. Should we think of the final form of 2 Corinthians as determinative? If there's evidence in the text for the purposeful editing of an editor, or a redactor, we call them, if the text indicates that a redactor has been careful to arrange things in a certain way, then yeah, absolutely. But what if these passages really do suggest letters that were just collected, not in any particular order for a reader's purpose, but just the way they were collected? Remember, the letters of Paul are arranged largely from longest to shortest. Maybe that's just how the ancient world collected and preserved these texts. Reading too much into that as part of God's purpose or part of the Spirit's inspiration can be a big mistake. It's a temptation for believing, faithful readers to read God's purpose into what might be coincidence. I don't want to encourage us to do that. So here's how I'm going to approach this. I will read each unit more in isolation from the other passages than I might if I weren't aware of the problem. Since I'm unsure that those passages are in their original sequence, and I'm unsure that the reason that they're in the sequence they are is because of a thoughtful editor. On the other hand, these hypotheses of letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, those are just hypotheses. I won't be grounding my interpretations of these passages on conjectural proposals without a lot of support besides the fault lines themselves, when different proposals from different scholars compete with each other and leave us kind of at sea trying to figure out which one of these to follow. These are matters of probability, and I will treat them as matters of probability and focus on the texts and the passages that do seem to hang together. I don't mind treating them as, maybe you could call it, a shuffled deck, whose order is no longer necessarily significant.